This is The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothschild.
Okay, this is our second time recording today. We did the program earlier. We detailed some of our feelings on the Trump. Of course, when people listen to this, it won't be the same day. But we detailed some of our thoughts on the release of the JFK documents. And apparently now there's an update. Trump has said that he's in coordination with John Kelly and with people from intelligence agencies that he is going to release all of the files, and I guess there won't be a delay on it. So that's a rather, I guess, interesting update, although I keep my rather cynical prediction that this really isn't going to lead anywhere. And
when did that happen? That happened since we last talked this afternoon?
I think it was just in the last few hours he tweeted about it.
Oh, dang, I didn't see the tweet. Thank you for informing me.
But that said, I still maintain my rather cynical prediction that my rather cynical view that this really isn't going to really do anything to reveal anything that is really all that significant when you look at the grand scheme of things. I still continue to look at the people who are directly and intimately involved in this, in getting this information out and in promoting the value of it, of course, which is people like Roger Stone and, of course, Alex Jones. And it's interesting when we get into this talk with the angle of Donald Trump as the right-wing populist and who's actually fighting for America and fighting to defeat the deep state. There's a lot of parallels between Donald Trump and, of course, the 1964 presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, who rose up in the post-JFK era. And I think I would love to see Barry Goldwater, or even Ronald Reagan in the age of social media. I'd love to see what their presidential campaigns would look like. But I think we've been discussing this a lot lately. I think that there's a lot of similarities between the populist movement of the 1960s as far as the right goes, and also the current wave of right-wing populism, which has swept America in particular, in the West in general. And when you look at an organization like the John Birch Society, which was extremely influential in shaping the far right-wing narrative in the 60s against what it saw as the looming threat of communism and of I guess you could say leftism in a lot of ways. I don't know if it was referred to as much as leftism at that time, although I think when the new left came to prominence in the mid and late 60s with the student movement, the anti-war movement, and the civil rights movement, I think that term became more prominent. But whatever the term was at the time, maybe it was just commies, and they were leading the resistance against the commie takeover of America and the move into, with all the global institutions, the post-World War II, I guess you could say, international consensus. And clearly a guy like Barry Goldwater was a key figure in mobilizing and galvanizing the right-wing dissidents. And ultimately that led to Richard Nixon, who also very much picked up on the populist rhetoric of the time. And I think with what we're seeing with the John Birch Society, and everything from the rhetoric coming out of publications and organizations like JBS and what you were seeing in the early and mid-60s, and then what you're seeing now with the populist movement, which is rose around Trump, you're seeing a lot of similarities from the rhetoric to the shaping of the narrative and the pushback from the establishment against these outlets, which is supposed to be we're told it's to hurt those outlets, but really what it is it's giving them the much needed media, much needed coverage and the much needed attention that is needed to actually bring people to these movements. So, Jeremy, I get further into this here as we go along here, but you have noticed some interesting things, interesting information that JBS in the lead up to the Kennedy assassination was putting out. Literature and pamphlets and things of that nature, flyers about Kennedy being a communist sympathizer, and this is in the months leading up. And then you also made an interesting parallel on our last show where you talked about how Lyndon Johnson, how immediately after Kennedy's assassination, the number of military personnel sent to Vietnam increased after Kennedy had started to put I believe he was actually starting to place a moratorium on they were significantly cutting down the number of military personnel who would be in Vietnam. This, of course, is before the fabricated Gulf of Tonkin incident.
And
one
the
of the
plan was to actually, I believe, was to have all U.S. Military out by the end, by 65, I think.
I see. That makes sense. And when you mentioned this with what Johnson did, and completely overturning that, and you think of an organization like the John Birch Society comes into play with this, and JBS was never criticized the Vietnam War effort. The only thing it criticized was that we're not doing enough to win the war. And in addition to that, it focused all of its vitriol at the time on the student protesters and the people who were opposing the war in Vietnam. And so you see this, and it really, I think, creates an interesting dynamic to look at with the possible role of JBS and the right-wing populism at the time. And they were so desperate, it seems, to keep alive this narrative of we must be fighting communism, that it may have welcomed this war in Southeast Asia, while at the same time, publicly paying lip service to the idea of not being involved in other nations' affairs. And we're seeing the same thing now, where you've got this, the enemy has shifted from communism to liberalism and Islam, although there's definitely parallels there, and that now it's an alliance of leftism and Islamism, and communism is taking over the West, and that's the real enemy that we have to fight, as David Horowitz has educated Alex Jones on the reality of. So when you look at the JBS's activities post JFK assassination, and the absolute hard line it took against the communist threat, which of course is largely manufactured, as well as the threat of the counterculture, which arose in the 1960s, which is completely a creation of the CIA and of a lot of the MK Ultra types experiments. And that's not to say that all of the activism was phony, because it certainly wasn't, but I do believe that was largely used to water down the activism of the era and actually bog it down into incoherency, as opposed to an actual movement that could really challenge the ruling structure. And we've documented what happened to people who in the 60s were in a position to actually create a actual mass resistance that could go somewhere. And of course, their fates have been well documented by a number of people. And you take that and you look at how they were acting post in this generation here, and you look at what we're seeing now with these Antifa groups, and once again we're seeing. It's interesting. You're actually seeing the rise of both the populist right and the populist left, and it happened in the 60s. It's happening again today, where you're seeing the once again the rise of the quote radical left with the Antifas and the mass street activism that's taking place, and the clashes between the left and the right. And now you're seeing the culmination of all these years of the mobilization on the hard right with the Tea Party, and now it's culminated in Donald Trump. And I think that really what we're seeing is so similar from you take a parallel from the political situation 50 years ago and the situation now, and you look at the so-called anti-establishment reactions and the opposition to the establishment. I think that there are a ton of parallels, and I think this is a great example of how history does repeat itself in so many ways. What are some of your observations on this?
Yes, this issue of, we're familiar with the idea of counter gangs in a military or intelligence fashion, of an actual group of armed militants of some sort on the ground who are created to basically give your opposition a bad name, potentially to kill innocents and civilians, and then it can be blamed on the people that the powers that created the counter gang are trying to undermine, whether it's in Africa and aspects of the British Empire, or whether it's things like Israeli intelligence in relationship to their Palestinian foes on the ground, and there are multiple ways of controlling, installing, disrupting, dividing the Palestinian leadership, all the way back to things like the funding and empowerment of the formation of Hamas in the 80s by large swaths of Israeli intelligence. So you can see that this is a long history, the counter gang, but more and more I think we can see that it, especially in the 21st century and the rise of the information culture and the information technology and really the information civilization, that the counter gang must more and more be seen in terms of an intellectual counter gangs that are created to run discrediting operations, to create dead ends, intellectual dead ends for people seeking an alternative to the establishment or mainstream political possibilities. So it is the case that something like the John Birch Society, in a similar fashion to the way that certain counter gangs like Al-Qaeda have been used in the war on terror, and we talked a little bit about this in our last show about the Kennedy files, but the way that the Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden and Atta and these types of figures are used in a way to create the conditions so that there is a patsy setup that has been prepared in the minds of the people to be blamed on them for what are ultimately deep state crimes against the minds. And you see this with the John Birch Society in the run-up to the Kennedy assassination. I believe they were behind the flyer of wanted for treason with Kennedy's face on it, and the kind of things that you described, soft on communism to dainty in his relationship to Cuba and Vietnam, and wasn't it the alternative later on was Barry Goldwater's saying maybe we should just nuke them, and Nixon looking into nuking Vietnam and these types of things. So you see that in a certain way, the John Birch Society and the release of that poster actually acts as a way of an idea of creating underneath the surface, maybe below the surface of the official Lee Harvey Oswald or Harvey Oswald or Lee Oswald, whoever it might have been, Patsy, singular Patsy. There's this sense of, there's a populist sentiment on the right that wants Kennedy to be held accountable for treason. And of course, one of the punishments for treason is death. So that's sort of in the mix. And then that is also then met with something like a full-page advertisement that was printed in the Dallas Morning News on November 22nd, bordered in black like a funeral notice. And I'm reading from Laurent Gouyenot, from Yahweh to Zion, translated by Dr. Kevin Barrett. It said, "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy, to Dallas," and it accused the president of having betrayed the Cubans now living in slavery. The veiled threat was authored by a non-existent American fact-finding committee. How can any serious investigator take this at face value and believe that a right-wing group planning to assassinate Kennedy in Dallas on November 22nd would sign their crime in such way, while at the same time trying to blame it on the communists? And it turns out that this was actually assigned by a certain Bernard Weissman, a Jewish American who had moved to Dallas no sooner than the 4th of November and who had been seen on the 14th in Jack Ruby's striptease bar, the Carousel Club, in a 2-hour meeting also attended by J.D. Tippit, the police officer who would be shot to death 1 hour after Kennedy supposedly also.
It should be noted that I haven't looked completely into this, but J.D. Tippit, I believe, worked I believe may have done security at an establishment that was owned by a John Birch Society member. So.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you sort of see, this is pretty interesting. So in a certain way, you have these bookends of these semi-fraudulent, almost framing type of public announcement of opposition to Kennedy in a way that frames a certain portion of the population. And one is done by the John Birch Society, which is seen as a sort of the grassroots uber right, the super patriots, and who think that Kennedy is not hard enough on communism. And of course, we've already discussed some of the background of John Birch Society. People should look at DC Dave, looking at the John Birch Society as a Zionist front operation started by elements related to the Rockefellers, high-level 32nd degree Freemasons, and these types of things that seem to miss the Zionist question in a large way. And then also this just highly constructed out of nowhere organization just to create a way of then framing it as the specific group of anti-Castro Cubans, maybe. So that tells us a lot in terms of this long-term history of utilizing these sort of pseudo-populist right-wing organizations and right-wing framing and sentiment as a way to pin operations of aspects of the deep state, in some ways aspects of the Jewish deep state, and other deep state aspects, but really thinking about it as this framing of potential Zionist crimes on the populist right. So I think we begin to see aspects of this in the present too, but it's become a lot more Baroque and complex, it looks like to me, because then there becomes the question of the calling out of the quote the Jews when you see the alt-right, and then people like Richard Spencer who are open to talking about Jewish power, but then somehow also seem to admire it in terms of Israel as an ethnic, ethnocentric, if not ethno-supremacist state of some sort that doesn't need to be dealt with in terms of its lawlessness globally, but needs to be emulated by so-called white Americans.
And of course, on top of that, then you've got Richard Spencer's allies, people like Andrew Anglin and David Duke, who are all about, they take the criticism of Jews over the top, but at the same time, they run cover for Jewish power by portraying these organizations that are hardcore, these organizations and media outlets which are hardcore Zionists to the core, that are behind Donald Trump, which literally brag of being created in Israel, conceived in Israel like Breitbart, and portray them as being actual patriotic resistance to the left and all that. So.
Yes, and something like the Daily Stormer, which is so over the top in a certain way. It's obviously meant to be a trolley type of operation. And we've spoken about this before, but people should go again and look at the role that someone like a Joshua Goldberg actually played on the internet for a few years there, and was apparently caught trying to set up false flag terrorism of some sort, even here close by in Kansas City at the World War I Memorial for maybe 2 years ago, September 11th Memorial event. But Joshua Goldberg also apparently created the image that was used by certain B'nai B'rith forces in Canada to frame Professor Anthony Hall and people should actually go look at it. There's a lot of interesting articles that are starting to come out in relationship to Professor Hall's case, where it shows that high-level Jewish Zionist representatives were contacting high-level elements of the Canadian government, especially in Alberta, where Tony's college is in Lethbridge. And using this image that was and the wording that looks to have been very legally constructed, with talking about the Holocaust never happened, but it should have, and kill all Jews now. This kind of rhetoric, And Joshua Goldberg apparently created this, and this was then planted on Professor Hall's Facebook page. It's a sort of like Facebook false flag terrorism. Is this the beginning of the new form of false flag terrorism of the 21st century? That's an interesting question we should explore. But Joshua Goldberg was also had an alias called Michael Slay, who was a so-called neo-Nazi, so-called white supremacist, being published on Andrew Anglin's Daily Stormer site for many, many, many months. So, when you see that this is the kind of guy that's creating this kind of material that's so obviously just over the top and is the perfect counterpoint for the kind of actions that you could imagine B'nai B'rith lawyers, salivating over to jump on, to take on professors who are 9/11 truth oriented, unafraid of asking the question of who did it and why, Palestinian and indigenous rights oriented over many decades. You begin to get a sense of what this is really, really about. And this is not about actually questioning and holding to account Jewish power in a fashion with integrity and reasonability. No, this is something about making all of that look, again, as in the counter gang, like some type of operation that wants to, quote, kill all Jews now, and puts that in the mouths of anti-racist and pro-indigenous professors who have proven it over decades of research.
Yeah. And on top of that, of course, the Daily Stormer does employ the notorious Andrew Weave Aurenheimer, the notorious hacker turned I believe he's the tech guy for the tech guru for the Daily Stormer, who publishes articles like the woman, depicting the woman who was killed who died in Charlottesville as a fat childless slut who had it coming, and therefore people shouldn't mourn over her, and we should Westboro Baptist Church the funeral and all that. So I mean, it fits perfectly in line with the troll-like tactics of the Daily Stormer. And I will link in when we upload this the program you did with Tony Hall and Kevin Barrett detailing the role of Joshua Goldberg and his connections to the Daily Stormer and Andrew Anglin. It's very interesting, and that is a parallel to this ad in the Dallas Morning News, and almost giving like a narrative for the Kennedy for the almost like alluding to the Kennedy assassination. And that's extremely interesting parallel. And back to the John Birch Society, I think that when you look at the JBS and you also look at its opposition, and I think the biggest comparison to JBS and perhaps the movers and shakers which were behind promoting Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign, and then later on Richard Nixon's to an extent, although Nixon was never portrayed as the populist that Goldwater was. You look at it, and it's very similar to Breitbart, or to an extent InfoWars, and look at the opposition to the John Birch Society at the time, where much like now you've had this consensus establishment opposition to the rise of this populist right wing, going back to the Tea Party, when you had a lot of the establishment Republican types who were shunning the Tea Party of Sarah Palin, and at the time that was going on about what was it with the Obamacare allowing death panels and all that, some of the more somewhat out there rhetoric of the Tea Party at the time, and it continues now with the establishment, both parties, establishments coming together to oppose Trump and oppose Breitbart and oppose Steve Bannon and oppose all these people that are behind Trump, and Trump himself, of course. And at the time, you look in the 1960s with the rise of the John Birch Society, it was William F. Buckley and his National Review, which was the preeminent conservative publication at the time, came out and denounced the John Birch Society. And of course, you had that war where Buckley was siding with the establishment of the time against this right-wing populist threat. And you see the parallel with that. And what's significant about this is that people will say, well, you're just trying to destroy these people. Oh, they hate the JBS so much, they're trying to destroy it. And they hate Breitbart and Steve Bannon and Donald Trump and InfoWars so much that they're trying to destroy it. I mean, to the point where Hillary Clinton name drops Alex Jones during her speech about the alt-right. I mean, people who listen to the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. Oh, well, they're obviously trying to destroy these people. But you got to look at it from a perspective of how controlled opposition works. And this is actually the promotion of the enemy, of the so-called enemy. And what it does is it creates a fight between these different arms of what we call the deep state and their tentacles. And what it is it's creating the narrative, because the only thing that's getting promoted are groups and organizations and outlets that are going to continue to perpetuate the official narrative and the official version of history, the official version of current events, in the way that John Birch Society was needed, because you needed this outright, more absurd, more fanatical opposition to communism to keep alive the Cold War at the time. And you'll see in many cases the establishment Republicans came together with the more radical out there elements of the Republican Party when it came to having a hawkish policy against communism and against the threats of the time. And you look at now where these same organizations that are almost like the offshoot, the inspiration, the offshoots of the John Birch Society. And once again, I will recommend Nick Spiro's work on the Council for National Policy, because that's a key organization in understanding much, if not most, of where this controlled right, the actual the means that is used by the anti-establishment right currently would be the Council for National Policy, and how this narrative is being shaped in a way that continues to, as you said, it leads, number one, to a dead end where people who are beginning to question what they're told and question the government, beginning to distrust everything that they've been led to believe, and they're getting tied into dead ends, and they're also getting tied into a narrative, whether they know it or not, that is perpetuating the establishment narrative, the narrative that they claim to be fighting against. In the 60s, it was the hardliners were needed to oppose communism, to keep alive the Cold War, to keep the grassroots population to continue to justify a need for a Cold War, and all this fear-mongering, and as a result, all this spending on increasing military and increasing nuclear technology and increasing all of this. And now it's the same thing, where you need this populist element that is fanatical against the threat of communism and Islam, to make sure that the population, make sure that the people that are angry with what's going on and that are not trustful of the political establishment are still into this narrative that has been pre-created for us, that Islam is our imminent enemy and we must be vigilant and hawkish against it. And also the third thing it does is it creates a boogeyman scapegoat to take the attention off the people who are actually pulling the strings and are actually responsible for the situation we find ourselves in. Instead of pointing our fingers at the bankers, instead of pointing our fingers at those who are controlling these organizations and think tanks which determine policy, let's get angry at the Antifas. Let's get angry at the left. Let's get angry at these people in the streets. Let's get angry at the Latinos. Let's get angry at the Muslims. Let's get angry at everybody but the people who are here to actually be coordinating all of this. And one more thing, let's get angry at George Soros and let's blame him for everything. Let's have him as the front man for all of that's going on now. Let's blame Hillary Clinton. Let's blame everyone and everything except for the actual movers that are really behind the scenes, that are really shaping and influencing all of this and creating all of this perpetual chaos. And at the same time, we're going to keep alive the same narrative that they're pushing, that we must have this perpetual state of war, all while paying lip service to non-intervention and minding our own business overseas, but necessitating the use of force overseas to fight these created scapegoat enemies in the Middle East.
Yes, and a couple of things just popped in my mind from recent years of maybe a couple years ago when Alex Jones started re-engaging with the John Birch Society and had the president of the John Birch Society on to talk about a lot of things. And it was interesting because then a few years before that, of course, the same McManus, I think, the president of the John Birch Society, was interviewed by an apparent Mason out of We Are Change, New York, about 9/11. And somehow it never quite got to the who and the why of September 11th. And so then when I think back on Alex Jones and who he's had on his show in terms of the John Birchers and the David Horowitzes and the Matt Drudges and even the David Dukes and the veritable lack of the Christopher Bolins or the Anthony Halls or the Kevin Barretts.
I'm just going to laugh at that first name you mentioned.
Right. And then when I just quickly search for things about such as the John Birch Society and where they come from, it's interesting. A recent article this last summer in the National Review by Alvin Felsenberg, the inside story of William F. Buckley Jr.'s crusade against the John Birch Society. And it talks about the background of this contention and this intense debate and back and forth between Robert Welch and William F. Buckley. In some ways, you of course can see this is a sort of like the never Trumpers of the establishment, even like people like Bill Kristol versus the new right and the alt-right of the Spencers and the Horowitzes. And then you just go a couple paragraphs down after it gives you the background of Robert Welch, one of the founders of John Birch Society and coming out of the U.S. Naval Academy and Harvard Law School and
how about that?
The Welch's Candy Company and all that. And then it says Buckley and Welch met in 1952. Their mutual publisher, Henry Regnery, introduced them, and they maintained cordial relations throughout the 1950s. So, and the Regnery, of course, is still to this day the one putting on the Richard Spencers and helping control the debate, as you say.
Yes, it publishes most of people like Ann Coulter's work, Dinesh D'Souza. I believe it was one of the editors of Breitbart. I believe Joel Pollack had his book about Trump's victory published by Regnery. It was also David Horowitz's magnum opus that Alex Jones gives credit for changing his perspective on everything, Unholy Alliance, about the left and Islam, published by Regnery Books.
So this is a long-term agenda in many ways of controlling the debate on the right. And this does operate, of course, across the spectrum. And in many ways, it creates the spectrum, these types of debates where, and I also then began to think about the turn in when We Are Change got intensely hooked up with InfoWars. And I remember seeing this very, very closely in LA. And I was very wary of this connection with InfoWars and stamping all the videos with InfoWars and all that. And then it did look like that the influence became from focusing on September 11th and the facts of that and confronting all types of political figures and public figures across the spectrum with the facts of September 11th and what they mean. It went from there into talking, sort of mimicking the John Birch Society type of narratives that are so easily made fun of. The Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group. Why are they going to the Bilderberg meeting? Doesn't that violate the Logan Act? And so it went from talking about September 11th to talking about the Bilderberg Group. And of course,
and now you even have We Are Change and Lou Grudowski going from questioning public figures about September 11th to taking part in, I guess, efforts to stop migrant boats coming into Italy. So,
well, I don't know if Luke took part in it, but he was definitely there to document Laura Southern, or he was helping document Laura Southern taking part in that. And so you do see this the Lauren Southerns And then of course, and it's interesting that again, these sort of new right people who are then brought on, Alex Jones to Laura Loomer. A lot of this goes back to Canadian Zionist organization, right? What's it called?
Rebel Media.
So-called rebel media. People should go look at an interesting.
There, yeah.
Wait, what did you say?
Tommy Robinson currently is doing a show with Rebel Media, so and all that is all about Islam and how evil Islam is. That's his whole shtick. So,
and they do a tiptoe with like the real alt-righters and the white nationalists and stuff like that. But when it comes down to it, people should go look at an event up in Canada that the head of Rebel Media, what's his name again?
Ezra Levant.
I think they're talking about the upcoming 100th anniversary of the
Balfour Declaration.
Balfour Declaration. Thank you, Greg. I'm missing my words a little bit tonight.
It's all good. I do it all the time.
So there's an interesting, and they have the professor from Canada who is sort of seen as the prototype of the oppressed professor by the thought police, Jordan Peterson. Mm-hmm. And they it's interesting. They have him also on this panel along with Ezra Levant and another person to sort of celebrate the Balfour Declaration. And although Jordan Peterson is much more measured, he is much more of an independent thinker in a certain way. He's still not a real rebel thinker. And of course, the Professor Hall, who's if there's a single Canadian professor should be the face of free speech movement in Canada, it's Professor Hall. Jordan Peterson has some interesting ideas, but his big thing where he's not going to be forced to say certain use certain his, her, they, them, that type of thing in terms of trans relationships in the classroom. Okay, interesting conversation. Yes, it brings up interesting issues about being made to say certain things. But when it comes down to serious core political issues in terms of Canadian society, and it's Professor Hall that's really digging deep. And he's not invited to give his perspective on the Balfour Declaration 100 years.
Just like someone like Joy Carriga not being invited to, or not being welcomed at the Left Forum.
Yes, exactly. And so you see like this turn into the sort of reactionary politics of the anti-immigrant, anti-migrant politics, which, yes, they have there is serious underpinning about the apparently orchestrated destabilization usage of the fallout from these largely Zionist orchestrated wars of aggression and destabilization in the Middle East and increasingly in Africa. And of course, we know from the Wesley Clark Declaration, but not only from that, from things like the Oded Yinon Plan and things like the Clean Break Doctrine of the plan in the post 9/11 years to go after Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. So Africa is involved with all of that. And so you, instead of pointing out that there is a lot of this that goes back to Zionist architecture, it becomes a reactionary thing about the migrants and let's build the wall in America. And of course, it's resonant with the wall that was built in Israel, that all of our police and security and intelligence people that go to Israel to witness and train and probably be compromised along with it in Israel. They go see the wall, the militarized wall. All of the Jewish federations in North America now have a proprietary contractor for biometric identity management that comes straight out of Palestinian checkpoints and Israeli military intelligence. And no, I still haven't heard the new independent media, the new right media, the Lauren Southerns, the Laura Loomers. Laura Loomer probably supports all of this. There probably should be invisible checkpoints in libraries for public events for people who don't agree with the killing of innocent people, whether
We don't
Jewish
want any
or not, by
ISIS and
state power.
Antifa sympathizers getting in there, do we?
Right. And also, I guess, don't want people who are willing to call out state crimes against the mind, or people that are willing to call out the machinations of the deep Jewish state, which doesn't give a flying fuck about life, Jewish life, and included in all of that. And that's been proven over and over again, including King David Hotel bombing, including September 11th. So the Jews of conscience must wake up to all of this. Don't be baited by either the Zionist-controlled opposition on the left, whether it's people that say that if you want to talk about facts about September 11th being obviously some type of core Zionist operation, and especially the agenda afterwards, or getting triggered by the counter-intellectual gangs of the right, that like the Richard Spencers or the Andrew Anglins. No, let's keep our mind, and that's the Jews of conscience. Of course, this is about a movement that goes way beyond either the Jewish people or even the American people. And even thinking of an American context, these types of approaches also, this sort of intensely partisan, this intensely ideological, rather than being principled and pragmatic in the frontal way, it sort of ends up in creating political movements that will never ever get legitimate consensus. Especially here in America. And of course, that's what the left is being largely controlled to do, is in hoping for and yearning for some future socialist victory, some democratic socialist victory in the countenance of a Bernie Sanders or something like that. But no, we need a next generation politics, an integral politics that goes deep, that is radical, and is not afraid of that idea of the radical, but is also conservative in the best forms of those traditions. And the radical, of course, means going to the root. It means rooting out treason, rooting out illegitimacy, rooting out violent power, these in a lawful fashion. But it also means going deep and getting and putting our roots in a deep fashion to bring up intellectual nutrients from deep under the surface, so that we can regrow deep and powerful force of the mind. And as you learn in permaculture design, the way that you bring water back and water, of course, is the solution, the solvent, the solution. The solutions lie in liquid and being able to flow. The way that you bring water back to parched landscapes is not by geoengineering and steering clouds and boiling seawater with directed energy weapons. No, it's by replanting the forests. And once you replant the forests, they then begin to send the positive tentacles out to dig up the nutrients, and then the sort of the deep mind of the forest, which is created by some of the fungal networks underneath the surface, which is the actual intelligence networks that pass the nutrients and let the forest know where certain nutrients lie. That's how you bring the rain back. That's how you bring the water back. So I would say that's why I believe in a pragmatic radical middle that brings the best of the legitimate left and right traditions together. And let's say in an American context, is very American. Yep. and is willing to bring the American people together. And not be afraid of discourse or debate or difference, and actually celebrates debate and difference and discourse and even friction, and understand that that's where political heat. Naomi Wolf wrote, after after my friend and colleague Stuart Howe did a very interesting interview with Naomi Wolf back in 2008, I think, where she sort of went the deepest that she had publicly been willing to go around September 11th, and she spoke about her own children having been impacted by the dust after the buildings were destroyed, and she said that it sounded like she would support something like firefighters for 9/11 Truth. It seemed like she was immediately leaned upon, and then she wrote this spurious article in the Guatemala Times that people should go read, and where she talked about how the problem was that there was a proliferation of conspiracy theories, and citizen journalists needed to learn how to cast light and not heat upon matters. But of course, we need to have both light and heat. That's the idea of the mind and the heart. And in terms of the old approach to the idea of convincing people, yes, it's the logos. The logos is one aspect. That's the mind, and that's through logic and fact. But there's also the pathos, which is the idea of the feeling. And then there's also the ethos, the idea of the ethical, meaning the I-thou relationship. So all of these things need to be in play if we're going to resurrect ourselves here in America, but then at the same time go beyond and universalize our approach to our politics.
Yeah, and none of this is going to come from following Breitbart or the Daily Stormer or even Democracy Now! Or whatever else you want to follow that is all about perpetuating the divide and conquer. And I'm so happy that you do bring an optimism to this in a way forward. And because this is a time where it's so easy to get bogged down, it's so easy to get down about things, it's so easy to just want to give up hope sometimes and just see nothing positive. So I appreciate the hint of optimism that you bring to a lot of our broadcasts, and I very much appreciate it. We need to come together, but that's what controlled opposition is designed to do, is to keep the people from coming together. So very much I appreciate you bringing that line of thinking to this program. And on that, you mentioned the migrant crisis and how it's used whereas on one hand there are serious issues associated with, there are serious problems with just bringing in millions of people who've never been to Europe, who are completely unaccustomed to European culture and the ways and the values of Europe and of European people, and putting them in that environment without any type of coming to Europe without any type of preparation or anything. That is problematic, and there are problems that arise from that, very legitimate, serious problems that need to be seriously analyzed. But the way that the narrative is being manipulated and twisted by these controlled right personalities who have a vested interest in demonizing and vilifying migrants and immigrants just for the purpose of continuing to perpetuate this war on terror and this war against Islam, this crusade against Islam that Steve Bannon and all these right-wing patriots want to fight for MAGA and to make America great again, while they pay lip service to anti-interventionism, and particularly the boogeyman that is, I think, more than anyone else that represents this anti-migrant narrative is indeed George Soros. And we've talked about this and how George Soros has become like the ultimate scapegoat for the boogeyman. Like, you can just blame everything on George Soros. It's much like the episode of Family Guy where Lois is running for school board, and she just blames everything. 9/11. 9/11. Now, if you want to talk about something going on in the world that's evil, just blame George Soros for it. And that's not to say that George Soros is not an evil person, because he is. And he is involved in a lot of very, very, very detrimental activities. His fingerprints are all over funding the controlled left and funding these color revolutions that have created and caused so much havoc and misery throughout the world. But what George Soros, though, what has been created by this controlled right, by people like Alex Jones and so many others, is this narrative of this all-powerful being who just controls anything and everything, and that if we just simply were to defeat Soros, that we would be okay and that everything would be just fine, when in reality Soros is really not I don't think he's as powerful as they project him to be. Yes, he has a ton of influence, but he's not the person who's ultimately moving and shaking and is creating these policies. He's in a lot of ways, he's like a very convenient front man. And they even throw in the quote anti-Semitic imagery, like the pictures of Soros with his tentacles spread out all over the world, and you have Max Blumenthal comparing it to the protocols. And I tell you what, it's absurd for Blumenthal to just dismiss criticism of George Soros as anti-Semitic on one hand, but on the other hand, that's probably done by design, where you create these caricatures of Soros and his tentacles spreading out, much like in the protocols of Zion, the Jewish tentacles are spreading out and taking over humanity and are spreading the globe. I don't think that's done by accident, but this is a serious problem where George Soros is just, he becomes the convenience boogeyman to blame for anything and everything that goes wrong in the world. And I say, if you go listen to Jane Meyer of the New Yorker on Democracy Now! Talk about the Koch brothers, and you listen to Alex Jones and any given guest on any day talk about George Soros, you're going to get a lot more, or maybe Alex Jones ran actually about George Soros, you're going to get a lot more truth out of the Democracy Now! Expose of the Koch brothers. And that's not to praise Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman, but when you put this ridiculous over-the-top narrative about someone,
it was in the WikiLeaks.
He wants to destroy Israel. I know. Yeah, he wants to destroy Israel. He's a Nazi, by the way, and that also fits that narrative of what they're trying to portray the enemy as being Nazis are responsible for everything, instead of George Soros being an evil liberal Zionist who's trying to suppress pro-Palestinian voices and real pro-Palestinian voices. He's actually a Nazi. So this over-the-top narrative of Soros to blame for everything, it is a major problem that needs to be addressed, because I think what it does is, in a lot of ways, it discredits.
I think that's a very good point, Greg. And it's similar in a certain way to the talk about the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberg Group. These are institutions that are powerful, and they point to very specific backgrounds of power and networks of power and motives of certain groups of power. And so they should not be just dismissed as they are by aspects of the controlled left. In fact, I think I got blocked by the sort of left progressive comedian Barry Crimmins on Twitter for just pointing out that he was using the Trilateral Commission and making fun of it as a way of trying to avoid an entire analysis of deep power. And so it's both that it's like you said, it's like George Soros should be looked at in the way the left should be looking at George Soros in the same way that the left looks at capitalist institutions. Exactly. They should do a deep dive about what he's actually doing. How is he controlling the narrative? And at the same time, the right should look at the way that George Soros has been created as a caricature of something like Spectre in the Bond movie, and he is the root of all evil, and he is the one that's trying to take down the patriot Donald Trump. Is he part of it? Yeah, probably. Looks like it, But at the same time, I think you're right that at some level, you might, the best thing is to be able to listen to a lot of different aspects of the controlled spectrum. And in the midst of all of that, if you'd actually do your own research and balance what the different controlled perspectives are doing, let's say like a Jane Mayer around the Kochs, which is a deep dive, a journalistic analysis of the Kochs activities, or if you then listen to some Alex Jones in a less so fashion in terms of he's always referencing documents that he never quite reads, these types of things. But if you go ahead and actually do your own analysis in the radical middle between those two and have an integrated, higher level, next generation integral approach to what the truth might be about someone like a complex character like George Soros, especially like you're talking about like his relationship to Zionism, where, yes, as is pointed out by someone like maybe like Gordon Duff at Veterans Today, it was George Soros who was running full-page ads against the Iraq War, I think, before it happened. And at the same time, it's also George Soros who is deeply in the mix of trying to control the Palestinian solidarity movement. Yes. It's very clear that he's right in the mix of the Media Matters and the control of the 9/11 truth movement, and trying to get to the bottom of what that means in terms of anti-Semitic, anti-Arab Muslim narratives and the millions that have been lives that have been destroyed.
And Soros is also he funds the migrant groups that are advocating for mass migration, but he's also funding groups like the White Helmets that are perpetuating the chaos and the misery in Syria. So he continues to play both sides of the element with his tentacles. But I ask you this, what's more damning? Alex Jones alluding to WikiLeaks documents that Soros wants to destroy Israel, or the actual role that Soros-funded pro-Palestinian groups have played in suppressing actual dissidents of what of Zionist power and influence?
That's a good point, Greg. And so then the thing becomes then what should we look at in relationship to Alex Jones, which would be about his stand down of the populist right and their analysis that would actually push something like the rising populism and not have it be dead-ended or contained or even misdirected by something like the MAGA, hashtag Krav Maga, chokehold the Palestinian agenda of the Trump people and their attempt to
chokehold all Muslims, by the way.
Yes. So that also should be looked at. But I think that your point about Soros's actual influence on the ground in relationship to sort of neutralizing or neutering the teeth of the potential Palestinian solidarity movement needs to be looked at in terms of its actual effect on the ground. And in a certain way, I would say that's why someone like Gilad Atzmon is so threatening to aspects of the controlled left.
Exactly. And it needs to be analyzed in a sober and actually analytical, actually rational basis. And of course, people like Alex Jones aren't going to address the Soros influence suppression of real dissidents within the Palestinian solidarity movement, because Alex Jones doesn't want to address that, because the people behind Alex Jones support all that suppression. So there you go. It's in the WikiLeaks. He wants to destroy Israel. No, he doesn't. He might oppose Netanyahu, but he doesn't want to destroy Israel.
No, he wants to destroy the 9/11 truth movement. That's what he wants to do. And apparently so do you, Alex.
Yeah, and he's destroying the Palestinian solidarity movement by helping to keep the rhetoric controlled and under policing rhetoric through his various agents within the movement. So
let's remember to maintain our intellectual dignity and know that when it comes to the thought police, we are the ones responsible for knowing our intellectual rights and maintaining them, and knowing how to say no to controlled narratives. So, and that's what I appreciate about our conversations here at The Antidote, Greg. So,
indeed, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And signing off. Talk to you next time. I think November is going to be a big month, so we'll probably have a lot coming forward here in the next month or so. We'll see how it plays out.
All right. Till next time. Bye.
Bye.